Good evening, friends. We are all in our locations and welcome you to the Stanley Grenz Lectureship Series, our 9th annual series. It is my pleasure. My name is Derek McNeil. I'm the president and provost of the Seattle School, and it is my pleasure to be the host for this evening. The Stanley Lecture Series, or Stanley Grenz Lectureship Series, is offered by the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology in honor of Professor Stanley Grenz. Stan was a prolific Christian scholar with a pastoral heart and a deep intellectual presence. He engaged the challenging theological questions of his generation with a profound sensitivity to the complexities of a Christian community embedded within a cultural context. In honor of him, this series is designed to invite scholarly theological discourse into the public forum as an expression of Christian faith and service. This evening, we are gifted and pleasured, it's a pleasure to invite a friend and a partner, Dr. James Amadon. James is the Executive Director of Circlewood, an organization dedicated to accelerating the greening of faith. In pursuit of this mission, James has led the creation of media outlets such as the Earthkeepers podcast and the online journal Ecological Disciple, the development of educational materials and partnerships, including a promising partnership with the Seattle School. James has a BA from Gordon College, an MDiv from North Park Seminary, and a DMin in Christian leadership from Duke Divinity School. My goodness, it must be late. He is ordained in the Covenant Church and has pastored churches in Chicago, Salem, Oregon, and Bellevue, Washington. James' passion is the intersection of ecology, faith, and leadership. He lives with his family within the Cedar River Watershed in the city of Redmond, Washington. This is where I asked you all to invite you to clap and stand and welcome James. But on your behalf, James, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. And thank you for sharing with us and offering your thoughts and your wisdom.
Yes, thank you. And it's a real pleasure to be here with everyone. Thank you to Dr. McNeil for the invitation to share this lecture with you tonight. And I want to thank in advance the panelists, Forrest and Mary, who will be joining us at the end of the lecture. I'm looking forward to conversation with them and hopefully a little bit of critique as I share with you some thoughts tonight. So I want to give you at first just a little bit of context for where I'm coming from and where this lecture comes from. The first is, as I reflect on my life, I am a lifelong disciple of Jesus. And the longer I have followed Jesus, the more amazing and mysterious and beautiful and grand the gospel has become, to the point where I have come to see the gospel as good news for all creation. And at the same time, began to see it increasingly as difficult to preach and live out that gospel in a church that seems a little bit stuck with an understanding of the gospel that's not quite as full as I think it should be. In addition to that, I've grown increasingly concerned, sad, angry, disappointed, confused, probably all the emotions you are feeling about the state of our planet and the destruction that we humans have wrought on this earth and on our fellow species and particularly vulnerable human populations because of our way of life. So those two kind of streams have come together for me. I see them as very connected, part of the same story, a story that's not working anymore, a story that cannot carry us forward. So we need a better story, a better gospel. We need a better way of life. We need a new consciousness. We don't need to simply move things around as they've been. We need to radically rethink the way we live, the way we believe, the way we live out our faith, the way we understand what it means to be human. And I think that that's been my path as a follower of Jesus, and my particular call has been to invite others along that journey. And that's been my particular vocation through Circlewood, as we seek to accelerate the greening of faith and develop this kind of new consciousness and way of life. What I want to talk about tonight is inviting you on the journey as well. And I want to offer everyone some things to think about, a few themes as you live out your discipleship and calling in the various places God has put you. And as you, from time to time, take up the mantle of leadership and invite others on the journey as well. I'm going to offer some themes for that. So let me begin. I'm going to share my screen. I've titled tonight's lecture, From Exile to Exodus, Learning to Lead Others Through the Great Transformation. This stems from those two primal concerns that I have about the state of the church and the state of the world. And I want to begin by saying that my concerns are rooted in my belief that we are currently experiencing and in a state of exile. And by exile, I mean an unwanted forced departure. Typically, exiles happen when a person or a group moves from one place that they want to be to a place that they don't want to be, or one way of life that they enjoy or like to one that they don't. And of course, I have in mind the exile themes that are all throughout Scripture, whether it's Adam and Eve being exiled from the garden or the people of Israel being exiled to Babylon. We find ourselves in a state of exile, and it's taking two forms. The first form is planetary exile. We have moved from a period geologists call the Holocene, which is defining the last 10,000 years as one of the most stable periods of our geologic history, a time when human beings and many, many other creatures could thrive on a stable planet. We have upset that balance, upset that stability to the point where geologists now think we are entering a new geologic time period that many are calling the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. Our impacts have become so widespread and pervasive that we are creating a whole new geologic era on the earth. And we are essentially evicting ourselves from this stable period that we have enjoyed. And I think that means we're in a state of planetary exile. Now, while I'm calling this planetary exile, fundamentally at the root of it, it's not about the planet. It's a cultural issue. It's the way human beings have understood themselves and organized our common life that has wrought such destruction on our planet. So we're in planetary exile because of cultural misformation. In addition to that, for those of us people who are people of faith, I think we're also in a period of ecclesial exile. And by this, I mean that we have moved as a church from the center of cultural life to the periphery. Whether we're looking at data such as the Gallup poll from 2020, which showed that church membership falling below 50% in the United States for the first time in over 70 years of measuring it, to the even more precipitous decline of young people and their participation in religious institutions, all signs point to us moving from the center of our common life to the periphery. We're in planetary and ecclesial exile. Now, what do people do when they're in exile? I think we can learn from Scripture here too, is that there's typically a fourfold process. It begins by mourning a way of life that is no longer, or a place that's no longer home, being honest about the losses that we may not recover. Then we reflect, what got us here? How did we land in this place? And from there, we move into repentance, knowing that we need a new way and beginning to explore new options. And that moves us into a time of preparation where God may invite us out of exile and into something new. I think we're a little bit stuck in this cycle right now because we don't know what to do or we don't want to leave. But I do think God is calling us out of exile. And for that, I think we're moving into a time of Exodus. Exodus, of course, is another biblical term most of us are familiar with. And I simply mean that this is the opposite of exile in that it's a mass departure from one place to another or from one way of life to another that's typically chosen, moving from somewhere you don't want to be to a place that you do. So we need to move from exile to exodus. Here's what this looks like for the planet. We need a planetary and cultural exodus, what Thomas Berry calls the great work of our time, a transition from this time of devastation that we're reaching on the earth to a time where we can live at peace in a beneficial manner to the planet and all its creatures. This great work has begun. There are so many efforts being done around the world, in our own backyards, perhaps in your life as well. What we don't know is if it's happening fast enough. What we don't know is how much we'll be able to recover before the consequences are significant. What we don't know is what those new forms of life in this new way will be, but we are on the journey, or many of us are. In addition to that, we need an ecclesial exodus. This is the great work of the church. This is not about exiting the church, leaving it behind. It's about reforming it. I agree in general with the late religious scholar and historian Phyllis Tickle, who said that about every 500 years, the empowered structures of institutionalized Christianity, whatever they may be at the time, become an intolerable carapace that must be shattered in order that renewal and new growth may occur. And I think we're seeing that shattering happen in real time as our Christian churches and other faith-based institutions are struggling to move forward, getting caught up in politics or institutional inertia or scandal or all of the above. But I do think that shattering has begun. I also think that renewal and growth has begun. There is some great work being done on church renewal, faith renewal around the world. But again, just like with our planetary exodus, we don't know if we're moving fast enough. We don't know what the outcomes will be, and we don't even know what those forms will be. We just know we need to go on the journey. Now, as I said before in my introduction, I think both of these movements are connected, or what I might call an interconnected exodus that involves the planet, human culture, and the church. And this is the great work of our time. I think this is the great work, especially for followers of Jesus in this time of exile. I think there's a great opportunity to do something new. I also know this is no easy task. It's something that Pope Francis has called the long path of renewal. It's not going to be done even in our lifetimes. It's going to be a lifelong journey. But I think if you enter on this journey, if we're on this journey together, we can make progress. And I also think that we are called, once we're on this journey, to help invite others to join us and help lead the way forward. And that's where I want to focus my talk from here on out. What does it mean to lead people in this great work, this interconnected exodus that we need to go through? Before I talk about the themes, I just want to say a few words about what I mean by leading or leadership, because I know that leading and leadership is a loaded term, and in some circles, it's a contested category altogether. I was reminded in preparing for tonight of the Old Testament scholar John Goldingay, who wrote that he didn't believe that there were any leaders in the Bible whatsoever. In fact, no, not even a category of leadership. There are only servants of Yahweh. And I believe that's true in general, but I also believe that there are times when God invites us to go out in front and invite people to come with us and to go on this journey. And we're called to lead the way and to take risks ahead of those whom we are serving. And I think also with that in mind, these four words kind of help us understand what it means to lead in partnership with God. First of all, we lead as part of creation. That when we were created, as Genesis 1 tells us, our primary vocation was to partner with God for the good of creation. That we were in some ways to lead creation forward as ambassadors of God. I also think that when we lead, it's a conditional leadership. It's based on God's call to us and rooted in God's character. In other words, God can call us to lead and God can tell us to stop. He can give and God can take away. And that when we do act in leadership, it's rooted in God's character of service and sacrifice on behalf of creation. Thirdly, our leadership is contextual. It always serves the needs of particular people in particular places at particular times. And it's task-based rather than positional, meaning that we lead and then when our work is done, we step down and let someone else lead. Which leads me to the fourth C here, which is leadership is communal. And by that, I mean that everybody leads from time to time. In your life, you have some power and authority over others. You get to guide them. You get to guide groups from time to time. I'm sure most people in this group maybe are in formal positions of leadership. Sometimes we do this individually. Sometimes we do this together. But I think the way forward has more of the communal aspect to it, where we're looking at how do we lead together? Well, with that in mind, I want to offer 3 themes for how we might lead the way forward. The first theme is perhaps the most important, that as disciples, as followers of Jesus, one of the most important things that we can do to lead the way forward is to weave creation and redemption back together. This comes from an understanding that Western theology over the last several centuries has functionally divorced and separated creation from redemption. In other words, creation, the world as God has made it, is separate from what God has done in history through the people of Israel and through Jesus Christ. Weaving these back together theologically and in our personal discipleship is the way that we can be prepared most powerfully to lead this great journey from exile to Exodus. It gives us a new sense of vocation and new possibilities for life together. So let's explore this a little bit, what it means to weave creation and redemption back together theologically. Primarily, this has to do with undoing dualism. And dualism, for those who need a quick reminder, is a way of thinking, a way of being in the world that separates the material and non-material and privileges the latter. In philosophy, this means privileging the life of the mind or thought over the life in the body or in the world. And in religion and spirituality, it's the privileging of the life of the spirit or life in heaven, somewhere else, over life in the body rooted here on the earth. I've been helped in thinking through this particular issue by a lot of people, but especially Wendell Berry. He writes a lot about what it means to live in a world of dualism and say that it represents a true cleavage or a radical discontinuity between creator and creature, spirit and matter, religion and nature, religion and economy, worship and work, and so on. In other words, in a creation that is held together by God, we have pulled those things apart, and at the heart is the philosophy and religion of dualism. And there are 3 P's here I want to highlight just to help us understand how important this is. The first is that the dualism I'm talking about is pervasive. It's simply part of our cultural and religious consciousness. We are dualists without even thinking, which has led it to be prejudicial in that our understanding of how we fit in this creation is predominantly anthropocentric, meaning focused solely on human beings, and that humans are at the top of the planetary hierarchy. I think this also leads to hierarchies within the human community, which at the moment we see in the tension around undoing some structures of power and control that centered around Western white males, rooted in the kind of dualism that I'm talking about. Because it's so pervasive and prejudicial, it has become permissive, which means that this type of dualism has enabled the abuse of the earth and its creatures. If they are not valued, then they can be abused. And this kind of theological system has enabled Christians to be complicit in the abuse of creation and its creatures, and its vulnerable human creatures as well. What I have discovered in my own studies, which I'm sure many of you have, is this theological dualism is not biblical. One of the great gifts of eco-theology and eco-theologians is that they are helping us recover a non-dualistic reading of Scripture. And there's great work to be done, although I think it is taking just a bit of time to take root in the church and find its way in the life of the average Christian. In fact, J. Richard Middleton refers to it as the Bible's best kept secret, typically unknown to most church members and even to many clergy, no matter what their theological stripe. And he's talking about the way that the Bible doesn't see creation and redemption as separate, but as a holistic vision. So I want to take a moment and look at some examples from the book of Exodus. And I think it will help us because the book of Exodus is a book about redemption, but what we sometimes miss is the way that it weaves together creation and redemption in a holistic way. It's also helpful to us because it is the story of a great transition from one place to another, from one way of life to another. And it's also for those of us who have the privilege of leading from time to time, it's a great study in leadership as we journey with Moses as he leads the people. So I just want to highlight a couple of themes for us to get us thinking kind of theologically and biblically about this in light of Exodus, or using Exodus as an example. Right from the introduction of the book, we see that Exodus is connected to Genesis. Chapter 1:7 in the introduction says that the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Well, if you're listening carefully, you hear echoes of Genesis 1, being fruitful and multiplying, increasing, and filling the land. In other words, they were doing exactly what they should be doing. They were fulfilling their creational mandate. And the rest of Exodus is essentially going to see whether Pharaoh and the empire of Egypt can stop God's will for creation. That the redemption of the people of Israel is connected directly to God's purposes in creation. We see this also in the names of God that the book of Exodus uses. When God tells Moses to go to the Israelites, Moses asks, "Who should I say sent me?" And God says, "Say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your ancestors, has sent me to you." Well, there's two names in there, Yahweh, or I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, which is a creational name, the God of all that is and all that will be. And yet in the next phrase, he says, tell them it's the God of your ancestors, the one who has acted in history and has guided your people and will guide them. Creation, redemption, held together in the very names of God that God gives Moses. When Moses finally confronts Pharaoh, we see this weaving together of creation and redemption in the confrontation over the plagues. The plagues might seem like an odd way to confront Pharaoh, but fundamentally, the question of the plagues is, who is the Lord of creation? Pharaoh and the empire of Egypt controlled everything around them, including the flow of the Nile. The confrontation that the plagues brings about is about who provides for the world, who holds the power of life and death. And when the 10 plagues come and go over Egypt, the Old Testament scholar Terry Fretheim says we can see God temporarily undoing creation to show Pharaoh who is ultimately in charge. For instance, when we look at the second plague, when Moses touches the water of the Nile and it turns to blood, what he's touched is the very life force of the empire. It's physical, economic, and political life. Pharaoh's empire was one of amassing more and more and more. And the Nile was the symbol of that life and power. So when God turns it to blood, God is attacking Pharaoh right at the core of his power and control. And if you're reading carefully, you notice when that plague is over, God waits 7 full days to visit the next plague. And we're supposed to see here that there's some connection again to creation as he's working to free the people of Israel. When finally they are sent to cross the sea, God separates the waters and they pass through on dry land. That should key to us as well the original creation of separating the water from the land. And Pharaoh's army, symbols of the forces of chaos and death pursuing them, are overcome when the waters come back down and they are subdued. And the people of Israel cross into a new world and a new life. What we have in that moment is a small microcosm of creation wound up in their redemption. Finally, the last example I want to give is of the law. We often don't interact with the law given in the Pentateuch and in the book of Exodus. But if you read it again, try to see it as a comprehensive way of life, that God, in giving the law to Moses and the people, is teaching them how to create, foster, and protect all the relationships inherent in creation. That it is a way of life that helps them connect to God, one another, and the whole community of creation. So in that brief summary, I just wanted us to see that in the book of Exodus, creation and redemption are woven together in a big story of liberation, moving the people from one way of life to another. Now, how can we take that kind of theological perspective and think about creative application to our own day? Well, I'll give you a big example. I was thinking recently about the 10 plagues visited on Pharaoh and how they might relate to the 9 planetary boundaries that have been identified by the Stockholm Resilience Center. So these are 9 boundaries on our planet that help keep our planet healthy and safe for us and other creatures. And we have crossed at least 4. Those 4 that you see in bold. And it makes me wonder if we can't make some connection from the plagues of Egypt to the plagues that we are beginning to experience around the planet. Could we see this as a way of God trying to get our attention for those of us who are more like Pharaoh or who have lived in a culture that is more like Egypt, where we are in the center of empire? Are we being essentially encouraged to a new way of life simply when we look at these planetary boundaries? Well, that's one way that's kind of sparked my thinking. As you think of your own theological journey, one practice I'd encourage you to consider is to simply pay attention to the theology that you read, hear, preach, teach, and practice. What do you notice about the relationship between creation and redemption? And how can you bring them together in your life and work? Well, that's my reflections sort of on theology. I want to move to the next aspect I think that we need to pay attention to as we're going to lead people in this great work of Exodus, and that is our own personal discipleship. And in that, I want to offer a model called ecological discipleship, that our disconnected discipleship, which comes out of a dualistic worldview, has essentially divorced us from the material world. And we need to develop a more robust discipleship that helps us live in 3 dimensions: the personal dimension, the social dimension, and what I'm calling tonight the bioregional dimension. I think we're pretty good at the personal and the social. There's lots of work to be done in both those areas and how to connect them both. But I want to focus on that third bioregional one because it's the one most unfamiliar to us, and I think the one that needs the most development. So how do we develop a 3-dimensional discipleship? How do we become bioregional disciples? I want to say that it's as simple as sitting at the feet of creation. Disciples are those who sit at the feet of teachers. And right now, God is inviting us to learn by sitting at the feet of creation. Now, this doesn't mean it doesn't involve humans. In fact, humans are part of creation. And one of the ways I've developed a more interconnected discipleship is by sitting at the feet of integrated teachers. We all need to find teachers to help lead us down this path. And there are many out there. I just want to share a few of mine to maybe inspire you and for you to remember maybe some of your own. First of all, I want to highlight the 2 Francises. Francis of Assisi, who was way ahead of his time in thinking and living out the gospel of all creation, and the current Pope of the Catholic Church, Pope Francis, who, when choosing the name Francis, did so because he was, in his words, a man of poverty, a man of peace, and a man who loves and protects creation. Now, I don't necessarily agree with everything Pope Francis has said or done, but I find this particular aspect of his life and witness very, very compelling. And if you haven't read his encyclical Laudato Si, it's a beautiful piece of eco-faith work, where he calls us to lives of integral ecology. I do think, however, it's important to find teachers who can guide us who are outside of our particular social location. So for me, I have definitely been helped by Randy Woodley of the Elohe Center for Earth Justice. Randy's a legal descendant of the Cherokee Nation and a fellow follower of Jesus. He encourages people like me, Euro-Western people, to discover what my indigenous ancestors once knew, and as you see in this quote, in so many ways to become indigenous again. That is a huge challenge, and something that I'm wrestling with is how to do that in a way that's appropriate and also can repair relationships with indigenous people and indigenous groups that have been on the wrong end of Euro-Western colonization. Randy is helping lead me forward in that area. Just one more I want to share with you. The late Bell Hooks, who we are mourning, who passed away recently. I'm thinking particularly of her book, Belonging, which traces her journey and her sense of call. She was an urban person most of her life, but later in life moved home to rural Kentucky. People know her mostly as a feminist writer and cultural critic, but she also wrote in this book, Belonging, very beautifully about the connection between race and ecology and interconnected justice, and just has helped me see things in a new light and ask questions about my own social location and my relation to these movements. So those are some of the integrated teachers that have helped me move my discipleship along, but I also know that sitting at the feet of creation also means looking beyond the world of humanity to the creatures around us. One of my favorite passages of scripture is from Job chapter 12. Ask the animals and they will teach you, or the birds in the sky and they will tell you, or speak to the earth and it will teach you, or let the fish in the sea inform you. Which of all of these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind. I think we can learn from our fellow creatures by spending time outside the human-dominated world. And that can come in lots of forms, whether you live in an urban, suburban, rural, or wilderness environment. I think we can also develop what's often called ecological literacy, which is simply learning how the world works, learning the names and the relationships of the flora and fauna and geological features of your area. And I think it comes when we develop an ecological spirituality, which is where we look to encounter God in and through the creaturely world. Just as Moses did on Mount Sinai in the burning bush, God and creation coming together. I want to give you a way to think about this comprehensively, which is in the phrase becoming bioregional. And perhaps we might even say becoming bioregional disciples. Ched Myers, who is a real proponent of this, he often calls it watershed discipleship, says that Christians have been socialized to be more loyal to abstractions and superstructures than literate in the actual biosphere that sustains us, more adept at mobility than grounded in the bioregions in which we reside, but do not truly inhabit. Becoming bioregional means knowing your large region, defined by the major topographical features that it shares in common. It means getting a little bit closer to where you live by looking at your watersheds, where water falls and how it flows and supports the life of creatures in your area. And then it continues down more locally into your neighborhood, where you look at the human community and the non-human community and how they live together. place, people, creatures, history, everything that's happening in your region. This is what it means to become a bioregional. So as I conclude this part of weaving creation and redemption together, simply want to invite you to two practices. One would be to reflect on your discipleship. And if you think about in your life, what dimensions have been emphasized or not emphasized? And do you have people in your life guiding you into greater integration? And do you have places where you go to connect deeply with the non-human world? And in terms of bioregional exegesis, can you learn to study your bioregion, the particular features, history, issues that go into the place that you live? This is what it means to weave creation and redemption together theologically in our discipleship. And it can help us in our vocation, in the ways that we live, in the particular callings that God has given us. Now, when we do that, I want to just explore for a few minutes what happens when we go on this journey ourselves, when we understand these theological shifts, when we understand the planetary changes that we make and commit to them, when we reroute our discipleship in our particular bioregions, when we invite people to that journey, we often are resisted. So theme 2, and this is a particular one for those who find themselves in positions of leadership or with tasks of leadership, is that we need to be ready for resistance. This is not easy work to change the way people are, to lead them from exile to Exodus. Humans are both incredibly adaptive and incredibly resistant. The church is one of the most adaptive institutions in history, but the level of change that we need is hard to come by. We tend to wait to make big transformations in our lives, in our communities, until we have no choice. And there's a reason for that. It's important that leaders understand the levels of change that people go through. And I've been helped by this, by the scholar Larry Rasmussen. He's got a great book called Earth Honoring Faith, in which he identifies 3 levels of change that people go through. The first level of change is, you know something needs to change, but you offer technical solutions. This is trying to do what's already done in a better way so we can maintain our way of life without having to change all that much. When that doesn't work, people realize they need a paradigm shift. And this next level is grounded in sort of a realization that a whole-scale shift in the way we live is needed. We need new ways of thinking, new skills, and new institutions. But there comes a point where we realize that even that doesn't work, where we need a shift in consciousness and cosmology. Here is where new perceptions begin to take form. A new world emerges. We don't even know exactly what it's going to be, but we can live towards it. There's new possibilities for life out there to discover. But it's risky work. And so people resist it. Because as Ron Heifetz and his work in adaptive leadership has helped us to see, people are dealing in these changes with loss, pain, anxiety, confusion, and conflict. So they will resist. And there's lots of ways people resist. They may revert to the past and want to go back. They may blame authority, especially you in a position of leadership. They may scapegoat people. They may externalize enemies, deny that there's a problem, jump to conclusions, or find a distracting issue. When you look at that list, I wonder if you see any of these in our culture or any of these in our churches. And I wonder if you see any of them in yourself. I certainly do in me. I want to focus on a particular kind of resistance because I'm guessing that many of you are leading communities who need to make some of these changes. And some resistance can come from within. Communities want change until things begin to change. And when change happens, leaders must expect and hold on to criticism and resistance, hold it in a creative way. Because in a crisis, when there's deep change that needs to be made, people want leaders who will give them solutions and make life easier. They want leaders who will relieve the tension, anxiety, pain, and loss that they feel. And they will turn on that leader, especially if that leader initiated the process of change. This certainly happens to Moses in Exodus. When Pharaoh learns that Moses is coming, and he tells the people they must continue to make bricks without straw. The Israelites turn against Moses. They say, "You've made us obnoxious to Pharaoh." In the wilderness, after this great moment of deliverance, the people pine for Egypt. "You have brought us out in this desert to starve. It's better the Pharaoh you know than the God that you don't." And Moses complains to God about the amount of resistance he's receiving. "What am I to do with these people? They're ready to stone me." It's really an art to know how to deal with internal resistance, how fast to push people and a community. And one of the things I've learned from adaptive leadership is the importance of holding environments, creating holding environments which are cohesive properties of a relationship or social system that serve to keep people engaged with one another in spite of the divisive forces generated by adaptive work. So you have all these changes that are pushing people apart and making them anxious and turn on one another and turn on you. Creating a holding environment where that can happen is part of how you make the kind of place and environment where people can really engage with these deep changes. I think the wilderness wanderings of Israel for 40 years was essentially a physical holding environment where they could shift from being slaves in Egypt to people on the way to the promised land. Holding environments are hard. I think in our culture, the ones that have held us together are being torn apart, but there are people who are working creatively to hold them together. I just want to highlight one. Her name is Catherine Hayhoe, and she is a brilliant, innovative woman who is holding the tensions together just in who she is as an evangelical climate scientist doing the public work of advocacy. In her work, she encounters every kind of resistance you can imagine, external, internal, coming at her from all direction. But she has found a way to create conversational holding environments where she builds mutual bonding, care, and hope with those that she's engaging with, some of whom are very skeptical about the work that she's doing. She's a great example of someone who is doing the creative work of change. So if I had to encourage you on a couple of practices in this area, as you are working with your community and may face resistance, is to resist technical solutions when it comes to adaptive work and massive change. Resist being the person who's going to come up with the answer, and instead create holding environments, asking people about the world that they inhabit and the one that they want, about the story that they've told themselves and what new stories could they tell, about what it would mean to head out on a difficult journey together. That's how you can help those that you serve stay on this journey of transformation and do the hard work of change. Now, in closing, I'm going to highlight one more theme that kind of holds these two themes together and isn't really a theme, it's really a practice. I think that those of us who are in positions of leadership or who find themselves leading on this journey need to practice Sabbath, need to remember the Sabbath. And that's because this particular practice given to the people of Israel connects these themes and holds them together in a really creative way. It is perhaps the best practice to develop an ecological and theological consciousness and discipleship of the kind that we need. And that's because practicing Sabbath weaves creation and redemption together. When God commands the people in Exodus to practice Sabbath, it's rooted in creation. When he gives that command in Deuteronomy, it's rooted in history. Both of those make the Sabbath about creation and redemption. Sabbath also roots us in a place. It tells us to stop, remember where we are, where we live, and to rest in that place and to get renewal and to be released from the burden of having to solve all the world's problems. Sabbath can help us remember the bioregions that we live in and care for. And finally, Sabbath is an act of creative resistance. It is non-consumptive, non-productive. It is does not serve the empire at all. And when done together, it can be a communal act of resistance and help create a holding environment for your community to move forward. So finally, last practice I want to encourage you is to remember the Sabbath. Sabbath is a practice that puts us back together. What has been torn apart comes back together in the practice of Sabbath. And I wonder if you reflected on your own practices of Sabbath. How are you remembered? How are you put back together as a human, as a disciple, as a leader? And what might be missing that you could add? Well, just as a quick recap before I end and we move into a panel discussion, 3 themes that we talked about on this journey from exile to Exodus was weaving creation and Sabbath back together, being ready for resistance, and practicing Sabbath. So with that in mind, I'm going to share one more thing before I bring Derek back on. And this is a passage out of the book Moses, Man of the Mountain by Zora Neale Hurston. And in it, I just want us to think creatively about our own calling as we think about Moses. It says, Moses looked past the outline of Aaron, mounted on a camel toward the Red Sea, and for a moment he wavered. Then he looked back at the shape of Mount Sinai with its shoulder-wrapping clouds and heard the mutter of thunder from its throat. He embraced Jethro affectionately and turned his feet resolutely toward Egypt. Jethro stood watching him for a long time, but Moses was on his way. He never looked back.
Well, James, thank you. You have quietly entered a disturbing set of feelings in my heart and body. And I think that's a bit of how we need to be, a bit more disturbed and identifying. We'll move into our panel's discussion, but I just want to, for those who are attending, the lectureship series is really built around a creative versus a critiquing style. And so as we invite the panelists, it's important for you to know that in the tradition, kind of Western academic tradition, we tend to critique. We break it down to see if we can identify truth, if you will. Well, this is an exercise of creativity or building up. And so the panelists we've invited to really kind of join James in the kind of conversation, to maybe some critiquing, but for the most part, we asked it to be a creative act. And so with that, I want to introduce you to our panelists, and it's a pleasure to have both. Mary DeJong is a deep ecologist, eco-theologian, urban naturalist, and practitioner and guide of place-based pilgrimage. She specializes in the spiritual companionship of rewilding. Mary facilitates rewilding retreats and pilgrimages in the in the Pacific Northwest and in Iona, Scotland, that strengthen a unique and mystical interconnection of participants, the sacred, and the more than human world. Proud of Mary. Mary received her Master's of Theology and Culture from the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology, with a focus on eco-theology. And there's my dog barking, which I knew the timing would be perfectly timed just for her to bark when my wife walked in. Anyway, Mary earned her religion and ecological certificate from Yale's Forum on Religion and Ecology, and received postgraduate certificates in ecopsychology and applied mythology through Pacifica Graduate Institute. She is a graduate scholar of the School of Celtic Consciousness with John Philip Newell. Welcome, Mary. Forrest Inslee was born and raised in Seattle, and after a number of years of living in Chicago, British Columbia, and Istanbul, he returned to the Pacific Northwest with his adopted daughter to start a graduate program in international community development at Northwest University. He currently serves as the editor of Christ in Cascadia, a journal focused on innovative faith practice in the Pacific Northwest, and he teaches for the new Resilient Congregations program here at the school. Additionally, in his role as the Associate Director of Circlewood, he hosts the Earthkeepers podcast and helps to develop creation, care, education initiatives. Welcome, Forrest. I'm going to ask each panelist to kind of share a little bit of their thought and reflection, and then I'll add and begin with a question. After that, and we may run out of time, but there is a question and answer box for you attendees. Now, I won't make this promise that we'll have as much time, depending on where the panelists go, for questions from the audience. But if you have a question, place it there and I'll review them, and maybe we'll have time for one or two before we end. But on that note, I'll ask Mary to begin and share a little bit of her thoughts and some comments.
Thank you so much, Derek. And James, thank you for leading us through such a broad scope of kind of the cosmic history, landing us firmly in our kind of the territory of our faith tradition, to bringing us into the soils of the ancient Near East. I love that last passage that you shared. And I really noticed how Moses knew his bioregion. He named the mountain, he named the watershed, he knew the land upon which he stood as he was beginning this journey. And that final passage, I think, really is what resonated with me and speaks to me about so much of the work that you are doing, especially in your themes of bioregionalism and this profound invitation to connecting to our place as a way for us to journey to our own sense of home and belonging. And your themes of exile and exodus, I think each of us in our own bones and in our own bodies might feel this to be true for ourselves, even within a faith tradition that would say, we have a home, we have a heavenly home. I think we're waking up to the dissonance of that teaching, of that ideology, that these hymns, these songs, these psalms that would say that our home isn't here, that we're just simply passing through. We're realizing how, again, that dualism has impacted how we live well upon the planet. If we don't think that this is our home, well, we're not going to treat it as such, right? We're not going to be very hospitable to the place. Yeah. So like when I was just sharing that we have a bunch of, one of my teenage sons has a bunch of friends over right now. They've been in our home pre-COVID. And so they know how to be good guests. They know that they belong here. So they know how to take off their shoes. But I've seen people in other situations where when they don't feel like they belong somewhere, they don't act very well. So they haven't learned the culture of the place. So I'm just, I think those are the themes that I'm kind of just feeling into, that we're on a journey. We are on a journey right now where we are longing to be home again. And this isn't a home that's somewhere else, and it's not going to come with a new planet. It's really going to come with our acknowledgement. I think that contrition, that a little bit of that critique of our historical kind of traditional teachings, and turn it around a bit and see, what does it mean if heaven is here, right? And if this is really our home. So I think those are some of the kind of immediate reflections that I'm bringing, and I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing with Circlewood. And yeah, pass it on to Forrest. Hear kind of what some of your responses are.
Yeah, I think, it's easy for me when I think about becoming a better Earthkeeper to really always think about ways that I can transform personally. Like, what does it mean for me to care for creation better? But I've been trying to discipline myself to think about those questions in terms of the community of Christ followers, the church really, because I do think that the only way things are going to change is if we do change as communities, not just as individuals. And I believe that this transformation that James is exhorting us to, this orientation of ourselves to loving and advocating for creation, I think it's more than just one interesting alternative for the church. I think it goes way beyond a couple of annual creation care sermons and a community garden on the church property. I mean, those are great things to do, but the implications of what James is saying, really, what's really at stake, I think, is the future survival of the church, the future relevance of the church. And I'm really convinced as days go by that the church, those elements of the church that don't fully acknowledge the looming climate disaster, for example, or don't actively advocate for environmental justice, they risk becoming increasingly irrelevant to younger generations of Christ followers. I mean, young people, as many of us know, are walking away from their parents' churches, and they're finding very few alternatives for belonging to Christian community that seems relevant to them. And of course, it's not just young people who are leaving the church. People from all generations, including myself, are finding that few churches offer substantial guidance when it comes to helping Christ followers to love and to serve and protect the community of God's creation to which we belong. As I was thinking about James's subject, it kind of attuned me all day long to things that were happening and things I was noticing. And there's two things I want to tell you about that were really helpful to me in understanding these things that James is talking about. The first thing that happened was I had a conversation this morning with my friend Tom Sine about possibilities for a book that he intends to write. And in our conversation, he made the point that many churches are in decline in great part because they opt not to speak up about the plight of the environment, or even worse, they proclaim a message that promotes environmental abuse. And Tom noted that in his research, he's found that churches have only recently begun to wake up to this alarming absence of younger generations in their faith communities. And to his dismay, he has found that a congregation's typical response is more likely to be, say, tweaking the worship style or adapting some new technology in the teaching, thinking that these adjustments to the sort of public face of the church will somehow attract people back to the fold. I'm sure that many of you who have young people in your lives know that the problem goes deeper than mere stylistics. And I myself know the sorrow of watching my 19-year-old daughter become disillusioned with the faith of her father, in great part because she doesn't see the church as having much that's really directly relevant to say about the massively important and terrifying issues that concern her most. Like a lot of her friends, she struggles often with a common condition these days that's become known as climate despair. I mean, she watches as the world burns while our faith leaders pretend that there's no cause for concern. And she wonders aloud to me if there's going to be any future for her own children someday. And she yearns for answers. She yearns for a way forward. And while I'm glad that she talks to me about her questions, it breaks my heart, honestly, to know that the church that she once loved has become the very last place that she turns to for guidance about how to live, as a better member of the community of creation. When I talk to her about what the gospel message has to do with the non-human members of the community of creation, unfortunately, she's not hearing that message in very many places, especially in the Christian community. So that's one thing that happened. The other thing was an email that I got. I got an email from a friend, a high school friend that I haven't seen in 40 years. Now, she's one of an older generation, those ardent and engaged believers who end up walking away from the church. And that demographic you probably heard of, Josh Packard calls it the Duns. We reconnected recently on Facebook, and knowing nothing about her story of disillusionment with the church, I invited her to follow my podcast as well as the Seattle School's online journal, Christ in Cascadia. And through her reading and her listening, my friend encountered a new and different perspective about the church's relationship to creation in those media. She gradually understood that maybe, just maybe, there might be some people in the community of Christ followers who actually encounter God most powerfully in nature in the same way that she does. In particular, she's engaged the work of Randy Woodley, whom James mentioned. And she told me today that the ways that Randy has explained to her the kinship of humans as members of the family of creation and the radically different way of living in the world that implies has really begun to dismantle the walls that she has built against the church, and in small ways has even invited her into a process of healing and of reconciliation. She's even begun to reconsider her belief that the community of Christ followers has nothing relevant to say about loving creation and caring for the planet. So I just offer those two stories all to say that, when James exhorts communities of Christ followers to literally embody God's love for creation and who we are and in what we do, he's not simply presenting one nice alternative for improving the church's public image. I think he's in fact presenting a stark choice that has everything to do with the future relevance of the church.
Well, that was a strong prophetic quality to that for us. Thank you. I want to invite you as a panel and team, if you will, maybe to respond to anything to each other, and then I'll offer a question.
Bring on the questions, I say.
Okay. I'll say this. I'm reminded as we were talking that there is a organizational specialist who says people or groups of people, organizations don't change until the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change. And so there is one question to you, James, about the author of the book on of the 3 levels of change. And change is, we're in an environment that's changing, but we're also trying to figure out how do we change collectively. And I think, Mary, your question or your comments about belonging to place. So this is my question, lead in. How do we let go of the old world? How do we let go of the old world? We have been formed to use energy in a certain way. Most of us pull up to the pump and don't think about it very often. We've been shaped to kind of transport ourselves around in certain ways, our agricultural style and nature of our society. How do we, that big question, how do we, in one sense, let go of the old world? And it may be the flip of how do we return to home in Mary's metaphor? How do we move from where we are, knowing that resistance is very much a part of our personal and collective experience?
Well, that's a really great question. I'll offer sort of just a brief thought and then kick it over to my colleagues. I was thinking in putting this together, particularly when I put the slide together of the cycle of exile, what we do in exile. The first thing we do is mourn and grieve. And that is a process that can't be rushed, whether you're talking about a personal trauma or a community trauma or a planetary trauma. I don't know if we can move forward until we personally and collectively just start to tally up all the things we've already lost. And until we're ready to face that, grieve it, feel it, I'm not sure we can move on. And, you know, I was thinking about the people of Israel by the rivers of Babylon. We sat and wept. You know, they had to realize they were not, even if they went back physically, they were not going back to the same place. Only then, I think, could they start to think about, well, what is it going to be? What could it be? How can we be different? How could it be different? So I will just say mourning and grief, as hard as it is a step that we cannot skip.
Other panelists.
I would say that an important question to ask maybe is, what are we really losing? I think sometimes, especially when you're trying to help communities to change, how you present the change is really important. And I think we have to be careful not always to present it as a matter of losing something, right? I think we also have to take into account what is it that we gain even as we lose. You think about, for example, just the values that drive climate change, right? I mean, we think it's biblical that well, not we, but a good part of the church teaches that, you know, it's humans' right to rule and dominate and use at will the resources that nature represents. And while I think that Western cultural ideologies in particular have come to believe that there's a biblical basis for that, I think it's really those values that drive climate destruction, that make us think that the world is ours to use, that make us think of everything in material terms, to commodify everything. And I just think that that is the thing that we're losing, right? I mean, we're losing the idolatry of materialism. We're losing the idolatry of comfort and our right to everything we want to have. So I would say that really it's important also to think about this change as in terms of what we gain. And what we gain is the capacity to rejoin the community of creation and ultimately to become more Christ-like.
I have to apologize. My internet failed for a moment there. And so I didn't get to hear all of what you said, Forrest. But James, I was feeling, are we still on the first question?
Yes.
Thank you. Oh, my word. I was feeling a lot of resonance with how you brought us back to the River of Babylon and the journey. And a lot of my work is with pilgrimage, the pilgrimage round, and deeply studied in kind of the heroic journey. And another way of thinking about that deep grief that must occur before transformation is embodied is kind of with the mythopoetic imagination of the dragon or the beast, that every heroine or heroic persona kind of encounters when they are on a journey of profound awakening and becoming. And I think about the courage that one must have when, these storied figures meet the dragon, meet the shadow. Ultimately, that is what the dragon represents, right? It's our shadow self. It's the one that has been exiled. It's the one that has been put so far away that it has grown and grown and grown to become something that if you don't meet it and greet it, it will devour. And I feel like in many ways, now I'm going to say something that I think is absolutely true, but maybe hasn't been said quite yet. If we believe that as humanity, we are nature, right? We are part of the natural world. We have come up out of this earth. We return to the earth. We are nature. But if we've exiled the earth from ourselves, we don't acknowledge our interbeing, our interrelationship. It's almost like the earth has now, and in all of their iterations of climate catastrophe, is raising up like the dragon, right? In this kind of mythopoetic journey, and in this journey of exile, and in this pilgrimage round, saying, you must meet me and greet me. You must, and you must integrate me into wholeness. And I think that's part of how the old world and our old ways of thinking begin to shift as we begin to embrace and hold this battered earth back to our breast, back into ourselves, and acknowledge, this profound interbeing.
Thank you. We have 3 questions from our attendees. Let me see if I can combine 2 into 1, and I'll do the first one, and it relates to the third one. We know the poor of the world are deeply impacted by the destruction of the planet. At the same time, in a world that is shaped by white supremacy, imperialism, and patriarchy, some of the voices of the poor seem to be missing from many environmental conversations. So how do we cultivate a conversation that is inclusive and liberating for all people in regards to creation care? Similar to the third question, so I'll combine them. And engaging with these ideas, I'm mindful of the ways that talks of ecological consciousness can often be very white and sometimes classist spaces. I'm curious about the ways in which layers of class and political analysis and liberation perspectives could add on to this eco-theological perspective in naming some of dualism, etc. So I'm going to see if you can combine those things, those 2 questions. They're similar questions, they're related, and how you might respond to that.
Those are really great, deep questions. And I think I will just give a response by pointing to one practice that Forrest and I do together, and then maybe a reflection on something I wasn't able to share in my presentation. The first is that with our work with Circlewood, we are well aware that we are learners and that we intentionally seek out those who come from different places than we do, who look different than us. And we often say we sit at their feet. In addition to that, when we have the opportunity to amplify their voices, which Forrest does an amazing job through our Earthkeepers podcast, we do that. Those two things certainly don't get to the root of everything that those questions get, but they're one thing we're trying to do, Forrest and I are trying to do intentionally. The other thing that's an interesting thing to do is read Moses, his personal journey from this perspective, where he starts his life as part of the Egyptian elite and sort of though as an undercover member of the oppressed class. And then when he rises up in an act of violence, he's exiled. He becomes an object of state-sanctioned violence and exile, and goes off to Midian and names his first son Gershom, which is foreigner. He lives as a foreigner in a foreign land. And I often think when he asks God, who am I that I should go back to Pharaoh? I think he's really saying, who am I? He represents so many different social spaces in himself, and makes a journey where he ends up with the Hebrew slaves and identifies with them fully. I think I take that as a personal challenge as somebody who comes from a more privileged class and background, is what does my personal journey look like this, and can it emulate some of Moses?
I feel like I'm really, really privileged to have a job that requires me to actually learn and ask questions and admit to everyone that I don't know. And I just think of the teachers in my life just in the last couple of months. You know, I think about Jimmy McGee, who runs an organization that encourages leadership in African-American college students. But I asked him about how he looks at environmental justice questions. And his point to me was, you know, never assume that you know what the right questions are. I mean, your questions come from your positioning, your social positioning, economic, even geographic positioning. But he said, you know, you'll never think to ask the question, you know, what is it like to live in a poor urban environment that's close to toxic waste dumps, which is often the case. I think too about a guy I spoke to yesterday morning, a guy named Matthews from, oh gosh, where was he from? Malawi. And he is an environmentalist, an activist there, and a journalist. And I asked him that question. It's like, how do I engage with the fact that your country is suffering way more than my country is, even though you contribute very little as a country to climate change factors? And his wise advice to me was, whenever you see news about climate destruction, like and the results of climate change, like the cyclone that hit Malawi in 2019, he said, remind yourself and say to yourself that I am part of the cause of this, to not keep at a distance, our connection to environmental degradation and climate change, but to embrace it fully, as painful as that might be. But he sort of exhorted me to be honest, really.
I'll add to that question, maybe the issue of capitalism. I mean, I had a conversation this afternoon with a mixed race group of men, and we've been talking about issues of race, and capitalism gets to be such a broad stroke comment that the type of capitalism we have now is not the type of capitalism we had 40 years ago, if you will, but the role of capitalism in treating us as commodities and the environment as a commodification. I think that's also linked to the question of oppressed and poverty. And any thoughts about that? Because sometimes we will not know how to deal with one of the sort of mechanisms that drives the economy, drives the way we do energy, drives the way we do transportation. Thoughts about that, or at least comments about that?
To me, that seems to get at a little bit of the wise teachings of Thomas Berry, and James kind of led with Thomas Berry's his words of this time that we're in. This Anthropocene is demanding a call to all of us to be participants in the great work. Thomas also has said that the earth is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects. And I think what capitalism does is just, Derek, what you were speaking of is it objectifies everything. It objectifies the world. It objectifies the earth body. It objectifies human bodies to the point where the human, and typically on a hierarchical scale, can be commodified, that the earth can be commodified, all in service of another kind of version, a hierarchical chain with the human on top, and typically in white centered Western mind, you have the white male on top, right? So when we begin to invert our thinking and no longer see the earth as a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects, most of these hierarchies begin to deconstruct. And we begin to really have to engage the personhood, the absolute personhood of the other, the personhood of all races, the personhood of all wild beings, the more than human world, the personhood of the planet. And you cannot steward another person. You can't, because that becomes slavery, right? So there's something in that kind of wisdom, I think, that I would respond to with that.
I think each of you has one. And again, I think sometimes I want us to have all of us to have a complex conversation about capitalism and neoliberalism. I think we've got to recognize the things that have been added, and though capitalism also shaped some early oppression in the country, that I think you're all saying powerfully, listening and engaging and being off of our home turf becomes important, that we have to expand ourselves, see ourselves as linked to communities that we don't really talk about. We may even talk on behalf of, but don't talk to. And that feels important in terms of our conversation. Another question came in, and it's probably the last one I have time for from the attendees. To Forrest Ensley's point, I believe people are not coming to or leaving the church because they want to be with those who speak the truth and speak the truth to power. Excuse me, let me read that again. I believe people are not coming to church or are leaving the church because they want to be with those who speak truth and speak truth to power. This is true for issues of climate justice and social justice as well. They are two inextricably linked, and I believe we are called to be leaders in the truth that James calls us to be. It begins with telling the truth about history, our history as a country, and as a church, and as a people. And is the panel willing to speak to my idea, and how can we move forward in this leadership? It's a bit of a challenge there, so.
Well, I'll speak to it. I think yes is the answer. I completely agree with that perspective, that there's a lot of accounting to do. I believe there's also repenting to do. And, in some ways it's hard to think about, repenting for the sins of our nation, right? Historical sins, but it has to be done. I mean, we bear responsibility for the outcome of those decisions that were made. So I do think that embracing a new story about our relationship to creation also requires repentance and sorrow and mourning, even for what has been done in our name, in the name of our culture, in the name of our systems.
Yeah, I was even thinking, and in the name of our God, right? We have to account for the reality that how we imagine God, we will image ourselves after. And so there is a long-standing history, millennia worth of history of imaging a God that is separate from this planet, that transcends this planet. And when we imagine God to be located in such a way, we locate ourselves similarly. We image ourselves similarly. So this is where great illusion of separation has been born out of, that we've imagined God to be separate from, so therefore so are we. And so there is deep truth in that, and there is absolute need to recognize that truth. And as kind of riffing off of this idea of the new story, like what are new stories that we can tell about a God that is so immanent, that is present absolutely within this planet? The great theologian, eco-theologian Sally McFaig, and her imagination to see the earth as God's body. I mean, that is a profoundly immanent God, and it impacts our worldview in all ways, because then when I'm encountering red-tailed hawk outside of my window or walking past western red cedar, I'm not just walking past an object or something that is just on the stage of my life, creating the stage of my human-centered life. I'm encountering sacred presence. And we live totally different with that sort of reality. And I think that's part of this new imagination that this new story that we've got to begin to live from as people of faith. And it starts literally in the ground beneath our feet. So as James was talking about bioregionalism, it's critical that we know our places. It's critical because it informs how we then imagine ourselves and how we imagine God. James, I know you have some words to share too.
Yeah, just want to say that it's interesting to me, the history of interpretation of, let's say, Exodus, and where people place themselves in the story. You know, who are the liberated ones who are going out to a new land? It's the enslaved Hebrews, or is it the persecuted Puritans going to a new world? I think it's really important to, for those of us of faith who use texts and stories, to be really aware of where we find ourselves in the story, and be brutally honest when we're not the hero. That's sort of, I think I maybe hinted at it a little bit, to recognize the times when I am more like Pharaoh, being raised in the culture of Egypt and empire. The story sounds a lot different to me when I place myself in that character, in that location. And then you can see how that kind of perspective can help us perhaps approach our own national history in this country a little bit different, by not necessarily seeing ourselves, and I'm speaking for my forebears, as the persecuted people heading out to a new land, but somebody replicating the sins of Egypt.
Well, we have 2 minutes left, and maybe I'll ask each of you maybe to give maybe 15 seconds of a thought, and then we'll close. And thank you.
I just want to say I'm enamored with this idea of new story that Mary brought up, that, you know, we can continue to live by the story that centers ourselves, that makes us the heroes. But that's the story of doom for the rest of the community of creation. I think when we learn to live the story that involves all of creation, I think when we see the kinship that we have with the non-human members of creation, it becomes a lot easier to act out of love rather than guilt or responsibility. So.
James had a beautiful slide about this idea of remembering ourselves, re-membering, becoming members again of the community of creation. And that's an idea that I've sat with a lot, especially in relationship to this idea of rewilding. And it's a conservation term or an ecological term that talks about bringing ecosystems back into whole health, back into whole relationship, reestablishing all of the whole connections. And I like to imagine that that's what we're being called to in a really profound way, is to rewild our faith, rewild ourselves in such a way that we are bringing ourselves back into whole ecological relationships. So we're not seeing ourselves as this dominant, beyond apex predator, we are back listening to our rivers, our watersheds. We are listening to the wisdom of Cedar. We're listening to how all of the mycelium works as a way to give us the wisdom of how to be in interrelationship, to be redeemers, to be ones who bring salvation and saving to the planet. It's only going to be, I think, through listening to what the planet is asking us to do.
I'll close by saying I know that a lot of what we shared today is on the heavy side and the hard side, but just as a personal conclusion, to say that the deeper I go on this journey into the places of pain and loss and difficulty and complexity, paradoxically, the more joy I feel, the more hope begins to well up inside me. And I think it's related to what Mary said at the beginning about the idea of home. Like, it feels like this is the way home through this hard kind of thing that we've been a little bit lost. And this difficult journey is a way to be at home again.
Well, thank you. And I will end with this. I was listening in early January to a tape of Jane Goodall, and I am new to climate awareness. I was raised in concrete and didn't have a deep appreciation for grass that was not owned by my ancestors. It was not our homeland. We were brought to this place. And so learning about green, I could appreciate, but it's hard to own it, because in some ways that's not been the cultural legacy in this country. But I was impressed with what she said, because some part of us can thrash ourselves for what we have done. But at this moment, we're going to have to move towards each other and collectively work to save the planet. So she said, if we lose hope, we are lost. If we lose hope, we are lost. Every single one of us must make an impact on the planet every single day. And that struck me. Every single one of us. That means we have to see ourselves be, in some ways, beyond the oppressive history that we live with. How do we join now in this moment? How do we engage those who have not been heard, who have not had a voice? How do we connect with each other? Move past our guilt to some degree to actually engage people, because guilt can sometimes keep you advocating for something and you haven't engaged in relationships for. And I think we're going to have to touch each other and have conversations, and tough conversations. But if all of these, we can make wise choices, she says, ethical choices in how we live, what we buy, what we wear, what we eat, then we'll start moving in the right direction. Lord, help us to move, continue to move, because I think we're moving, continue to move in the right direction as we move from exile and Exodus and into a promised home. Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you all. Thank you, James, for your presentation. Thank you, Mary and Forrest, for your participation. Thank you, guests and friends. Peace to you, and look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.